This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Robert and I are again joined by Matt Herron, an Austin, Texas author of science fiction and fantasy. You can find him at mgherron.com. We've got the full bio, pictures, links, all that great stuff at Storyworks Podcast. And if you've been listening, you've already met Matt, and you might know him from our early days when we were a video-only show. Matt is one of the Roundtable's original co-hosts. So welcome back, Matt. Great to have you with us for another episode.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah, so tonight we are going to talk about first encounters, and we're going to start the conversation grounded in the science fiction subcategory of alien first encounters, but we think this really applies to any sort of first encounter across the genres. So even if you aren't writing science fiction, there should be a lot of great content here, and I'm sure our conversation will cross the genre lines, because it usually does on this show. So. All right, have either of you written first encounter stories?
I haven't.
I think mine is technically a first encounter story, but I just think that there's something, like, it's not like a story where, you know, you're based on Earth and, like, aliens come to Earth and they meet them for the first time. You know, like a Men in Black would be like a typical first encounter story, right? That kind of evolves later into this whole organization thing. But I just think there's something very human about encountering something for the first time, because people are explorers. They like to, you know, test the boundaries, push the edge of the known,
right,
and figure out, you know, what's on the other side. So it seems to me that first encounters are a very human thing.
Right.
Even if we're talking about aliens.
Yeah, that's true. Arrival comes to mind. I saw the movie. I haven't read the story it's based on yet. I think I have it right. Arrival. That's the...
Yeah.
Okay. Because I think there's also Contact and, you know, probably 50 other movies.
Yeah, there's so many.
Yeah, with, you know, single word titles too. But Arrival, the aliens are always behind glass. So the contact is really, the story is really about us as human beings and what it means to try to communicate with somebody you have no experience with and no connection or bond with, somebody completely foreign to you, so foreign as to be almost unimaginable. I mean, they're like squids. You know?
Yep. Or like E.T.
Yeah. So I like what you were saying, Matt, about it being a very human story, even though, you know, at first glance it seems like it's a story about the aliens. It's not. It's what would we do? How would we handle this and process the experience of this introduction, this first encounter with the other, you know, which... to use the anthropological term,
Well, I think also, you know, we regard ourselves, not necessarily consciously, but, you know, we're the superior species on the planet. You know, we hold the balance of power over anything, and so I think the idea of alien first contact is puts immediately in question. You know, are they friend or foe? How do we communicate? And also, do we have processes for that? And what happens if people bypass those processes and, you know, try and make their own contact? And there's all those sort of other questions in there. And I think, as Matt said, you know, it's the whole trying to make the unknown known, which is like in Arrival, they're trying to even be able to communicate, which is usually one of the tropes of the first contact is you know, we have to establish some language, some common language. And behind that, there has to be even common philosophy or ideas, and so you start to question, what is it that makes us human? So it's, in a way, is it posing, you know, another question of our existence and where do we come from, and what are those big powers that might be more potent than us?
Right. And well, it's kind of an extension of the colonial period the colonial experience, but we as Westerners have always read the literature of the Westerner, where the great explorer goes out and conquers the land. But if you were writing it from the experience of the native peoples on the, then the alien is the explorer or the, conqueror, to use one of the common terms there. And so what does that look like when here arrives a person or a being who's presumably more powerful than you, superior in some way? Like if you are a tribesman with bows and arrows or spears, and here comes somebody with guns and cannons, they're technologically superior. And if we are the Earthlings and here comes an alien with a spaceship, they are technologically superior. And so there's that question immediately posed of friend or foe, and it puts us in the vulnerable position. Do we need to be defensive here? Can we be welcoming? Can we trust them? Is there a Trojan horse in that spaceship? What?
Right. And what's the fallout, right? Like, what's the damage that's done? That seems to be one of the tropes in First Contact stories. It's like, okay, these two very different species or peoples come together. Like, what happens?
Right.
What damage is caused?
Yeah, and there's sort of the War of the Worlds First Contact version where the aliens come in shooting, and, it's run for your lives, turn and fight, that's your only choice. Or there's the Arrival type of story where everything is ambiguous and we don't know what to do. And in there, the danger wasn't from the aliens, it was from the other humans. Which government is going to make a power play? Who's going to try to control the alien technology? Could this lead to another world war? Not because of the aliens, but because of our own governments.
It was the same thing in E.T., right? Like, they were trying to protect, the kids were trying to protect E.T. from the government getting him. And so the whole thing was about how they help him escape. Right? Like, it was more about like the evil nature of human beings and how everything that's different and strange they'll destroy. And so the kids were trying to protect E.T. from that happening to him because they cared about him. They realized that the kids realized that they had more in common with E.T. than anybody else thought. And so they were trying to hide him and protect him. Yeah. And so if something strange enters our world, do we, is our first instinct to destroy it or to protect it or to find a commonality?
Right.
And so that's the fundamental, isn't it? Because that goes back to what I was saying before about we regard ourselves as a superior race, or species anyway. Race is the wrong word. So when anything comes to threaten that, whether it be even another human, in first contact with a different, somebody very different, as you say, Alida, like a different tribe,
right?
You think that we're looking at our anthropological sort of studies here that would lend a lot to authors writing in this sort of first contact type genre, sci-fi or not, even if it's in the, as you say, in a magic based world or something like that, would really be illuminating. I remember when I was studying NLP, there was this apocryphal story about some first contact with some natives in some presumably remote island, and while they were there, some sailing ships sailed past the bay, and the people that had travelled to study the natives were immediately cognizant. Oh, who are these people? But they noticed that none of the natives spotted them, and apparently they worked out that, and whether this is true or not, but it's a great story.
Right.
They worked out that because they didn't have the mapping in their minds for that kind of thing to exist, they didn't track it.
Right.
But if it had been an animal leaping across the path, they would have immediately tracked that because that's what their lives were. So this was the first time they'd ever seen ships. So as far as they were concerned, they could have been clouds on the horizon. I mean, it's
it's like that. I don't know if it's true or not again, but like the story that if you show someone a television who's never seen one before, they see blue, red, and green dots instead of the picture that we all are used to seeing. And I'm not sure that's true, but it's the same idea of that you're, You
The
can only
humans have a
see
very
what you
narrow
can see.
vision, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
We focus so hard on whatever the thing is that we're after. We almost like exclude everything else. They've done psychology studies where they asked people to watch, a video where these two people were throwing a ball back and forth. Like
That's crazy, isn't it? Yeah.
Watch people throwing the ball,
Right.
and then the guy who was running the experiment, after the video was over, he turned to the experiment subjects and said, "Did you see the gorilla?"
Yeah, that's right.
And they were like, "What?" And there was a gorilla in the background of the video, but because he had the subject so focused on this ball, they didn't actually see the guy in the gorilla suit walking
Right.
into the video because they were so focused. So like same thing with this indigenous tribe. They didn't know what it was. They didn't care. Their focus was on, their own lives and their own problems. They just disregarded it.
So that would be an important part of first contact, wouldn't it? It'd be not just what do we try and decipher, but what do we miss?
Right. Yeah, that would be a huge part of it. And also, thinking about the aliens and the, tribes people, and it's the sort of colonial aspect of these stories. It's so ethnocentric. So whatever point of view you're writing in is going to determine all of these things. Like, what do you see? What do you miss? Is... the person making contact a threat? Can you trust them? How like you are they? How similar or dissimilar? Like, what could be more dissimilar to us than like a squid in a spaceship? That's
Right.
pretty weird without being horrifying. Like, if it were a spider-like creature, people would have such an adverse reaction because so many of us are afraid of spiders. And so, if you want to write the contact from the alien's point of view, then your alien's point of view can't be human. It can't be so familiar to us. You have to break with your own ethnocentrism, or if not your human centrism, your, kind of what you identify with, in order to present a different experience. Because it's really, these stories are all about us versus the other, whatever form us and the other take.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's exactly, that's fair, isn't it? As if you encountered a ghost, it's not an alien, but it's still not us.
Right.
So everything is me or not me. That's a hard thing to write about. And also, if you are definitely if you're going to POV of alien, then you're into experimental writing. Then I think as well, if you want to try and dehumanize what is essentially human activity, which is communicating via story, that's tricky.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and people have written in the point of view of animals, dogs especially. Catherine was mentioning The Art of Racing or Running in the Rain in a recent show. So I think it would be a very similar process, but when you have a pet, you're familiar with that pet's behavior and movements and noises and body language and all the different expressions. And so it'd be kind of the same process of, only without the model of the pet, you would have to invent the alien, So like, okay, the squid is going to be intelligent. It's not going to come out into our atmosphere. It's going to have a system of written language. It's going to communicate, not quite telepathically, but there's going to be some kind of similar. So, that author had to create rules for that being and then abide by them. But at least in the movie, we don't go into that point of view.
Right.
So you would have to start embodying that being that you've built from the ground up. And saying, what would it be like to have this body, to have this language system, to have this social structure, to have this mode of transportation as opposed to everything I know.
Alan Dean Foster is really good at this. He's the author. He did the novelization of Alien.
Okay.
And he also did this other book called Nor Crystal Tears. And that book is incredible because it's from the point of view of the alien society. And the aliens are basically, they're like intelligent ants. They live in like a hive mind, and they live in a different type of community. And he, drew this out to its complete conclusion. It's this entire civilization, and eventually, it's really interesting because this first contact terror that we experience when we encounter something completely unknown, he did that, but from the point of view of the alien.
Yeah,
Encountering humans for the first time, and it was like, oh, they're so weird and squishy,
Right.
like it was just a very interesting way, because he was so consistent with what this alien's like thought patterns were and what their beliefs were. He established all that really well, and then when he first encountered the humans on this spaceship, like he was filled with revulsion because they had hair on their heads and their flesh was really squishy, and how could they protect themselves?
Like,
and
what's an endoskeleton? Why would you have that?
Yeah, it's like, why is your skeleton on the inside of your body? That's so weird. So that was a really interesting book to read, and because of the switch of perspective.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're talking about with the, building the character and then going into that perspective and having to embody that to be something else.
To some degree, you're always anthropomorphizing it, aren't you? You're always having to take it back into, if I'm going to write about that, I still have to write about it as if I am sentient, a human sentient being, wondering what that might be like, experiencing humans as if I'd never seen them before. But you still can't, you're still assuming that an alien even has thought.
Right.
So there's just so much that's still from our own worldview that we can't escape.
That's
and it's
true.
a real trick to try and write things that sound and feel alien.
Yeah.
Yet it's still written humanly enough for you and I to read and enjoy as a story.
Yeah.
And I was, when you were talking about the alien stuff, I was reminded as well of Ender's Game. That's another good example with the whole series anyway. Particularly in Speaker for the Dead, which I think is the book that Orson Scott Card really wanted to write and wrote Ender's Game. Initially as a short story, as the intro to the Speaker for the Dead, because that was the book he really wanted to write. But then I think the agent sold the two books at the same time, and so he was forced to write Ender's Game as a novel. Really
I didn't know that. It's interesting.
Yeah. And so I had to expand this whole thing. And I just love the fact that we made this ginormous error. This whole first contact thing was just a complete, what we thought was an enemy wasn't. And same thing, we've got the hive mind, you've got the different way of procreating, different value systems. And in Speaker for the Dead, they encounter yet another alien species, which is wild, absolutely wild. And it's a murder mystery. So the aliens end up murdering one of the colonists who was closest to the alien. And it's only really later in the book that you realise that they didn't murder him at all. They actually gave him the greatest honour that they ever have in their entire culture. They dissected him and planted a tree in the middle of him.
There's another trope of alien contact, is this fundamental misunderstanding of what people are doing, or what the other cultures, the other people are doing.
You've got to have misunderstanding, I think, and then then we were talking about, well, these things branch out into other works of fiction. So anytime there's first contact, whether it be with the natives we were talking about, or whether it be a different society, or whether it be a different, just going to a foreign country, those same things surely apply, where we can only see the world from our worldview initially, and it's not until you interact, you try and find ways to communicate, that you can better understand, here's a different worldview, and this is the different perceptions, or these are the different perceptions that go with that.
Yeah, it's like farm boy going to the big city, or somebody finding love for the first time. It's just so strange and new to them. They don't know how to react to it. And what's interesting about all of these stories is how the characters react.
Right. Have you guys read Michael Crichton's Eaters of the Dead? It was
no, I haven't read that. No,
it was made into a movie called The 13th Warrior, and it's based.
Very underrated movie. I love that movie.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's a good movie. It's been a while since I read the story of the book, but you're supposed to believe it's based on a historical document, but I think Crichton might have actually invented the document to build the story around. But this Persian man in the, king's court. I'm not sure if it was a king or a sultan or what, but, this Persian man falls for the wrong woman, so the ruler sends him on a journey, and he ends up in Norway with the Vikings. I mean, this is, early medieval period. And as you read the story, you go through all of this cultural strangeness and the language barrier and what kind of food are these people eating? And oh my God, look at how they dress. And you get this whole process of from shock to understanding to actual cultural immersion and becoming one of them. And they have to go, there's some kind of monster coming out of the hills, killing villagers at night. And so one of the local rulers, like tribal rulers in the Norse people, needs to send a party out, and he picks this Persian as the 13th warrior to go battle the demon, which isn't really a monster, but the Norse people believe it's a monster and such. So it's a really good example of this process of confronting otherness, one cultural lens meeting another, and then going through the understanding, the growth.
Yeah. It's a really interesting book, just the way it's written from his perspective. He's supposed to be like, he's from the court, in Iran or Persia or somewhere in the Middle East, and he's been sent up here, and he's taking notes to take it back to the ruler, right? He's documenting what he's seeing, but it just keeps getting weirder and weirder, and then he actually becomes one of them, and he's like, who am I? What happened to me?
Right.
It's really interesting.
Yeah, and the Norse people are barbarians in his eyes. He's coming from sort of the center of the world, the cultural, intellectual epicenter of the world in that era, to the land of the barbarians, basically,
And they think he's so weird, too. It's mutual. Right. It's like, oh, you're odd. Well, what are you doing that for?
Right. Yeah. It's a great first contact story.
It's, even as we were talking about this, I'm thinking about, firsts in all sorts of situations. Maybe the first time, a new young driver is out on the road, and the very first time they get pulled over by the police, and they've got no idea of the procedure or the process, or maybe they're from another country, and in that country it's okay to kind of be familiar with the police. Like in Australia, we're pretty casual with our police. They carry guns, and so you don't make gun jokes with them. But that's whereas you see all the American police portrayed in the movies, and man, you don't mess with those guys. So there's that sort of first contact as a foreigner as well. I remember it I might have been in Thailand perhaps, or maybe it was Burma. I don't remember. And taking some photos. And then all of a sudden, next thing I know, I've got this military police guy rushing up to me, wanting to take my camera away from me and wanting my passport. And you just don't, even though I, obviously was a smart traveler, I had my Lonely Planet guide with me, and you knew that the social customs, but there's something there that I missed, that. You don't take a photo of it was a government building and it had a military person in front of it, and you don't take photos of them. So
yes. Yeah.
I managed to get away without showing my passport and leaving with my camera, but
that was lucky.
Pleading white ignorance.
Yes.
Wow. Scary, right? When you're caught in a situation like that.
Yeah. So,
I don't know what's going to happen.
So again, that's that sort of, it's the known against the unknown, isn't it? Again.
Right. It's us and them, the other being confronted with the other.
No common language. Apart from perhaps some pidgin English from the other guy, but even that was nothing. So really, some of those principles that are expanded just as one giant convention and used in one premise as first contact. Well, all of the things they employ in that, we can kind of shrink down and use in almost any interaction where there is a first exposure to something in the novels. Right.
And then as writers, we can take that experience like you had, Robert, and say, okay, how scary was it? What was I feeling? How did I get out of that situation? Playing dumb or, sweet talking or whatever you use, and then blow it up to the proportion appropriate for your story. So here comes the UFO.
That's why it's so important for writers to travel. To experience different things, to be out of your comfort zone, to be in a different culture, because, I mean, it's hard to empathize with that if you've never really experienced it.
Agreed.
And therein lies the first contact story, isn't it?
I think so.
Hard to empathize that if you've never experienced an alien before, so where do you start?
Yeah, and we're fascinated by it. We just want to know what it's like because we're obsessed with that mystery of the different culture.
There's got to be something out there. There's billions of planets.
Yes.
What if there is? What if there isn't? Are we all alone? It's just one of those enduring questions.
Did you hear that they might have found some biological life on one of the moons of Saturn?
Ooh, no.
They've done some. They sent probes out, and they're like, well, it has all the ingredients for life. So now they're gonna try to send something there to take measurements and maybe send some data back because I mean, if there's life there, then the question becomes, did it evolve like ours? Like, what does it have in common with ours? Because it evolved in isolation, theoretically, at least ours. So how similar is it, or how different is it? And if once we know that, then I guess you could infer more. Right. Maybe there are common ingredients for life. I mean, maybe intelligent life is all human shaped, or maybe we're the weird ones, right? Like you just don't know until you find out more. So I love reading about this stuff. Like, oh, we found water on Mars, or we found a microorganic life on a moon of Saturn. That's really interesting because they're so isolated. And if there's commonalities, maybe there's commonalities between us and another intelligent life form somewhere else in the world.
Right.
Definitely. I think every armchair scientist has the potential to be a great sci-fi writer.
Have you? So another really interesting thing, I always like to bring the science into it because it makes it more realistic. You know who Michio Kaku is? He's a famous physicist. He's a famous physicist.
Oh, yeah, yes. Yes.
He's one of the theoretical physicists who came up with string theory.
Yes.
And so he was talking on a podcast, and he basically said that intelligent life would have to have, and this is his theory, has to have an opposable thumb or tentacle or something of some kind that manipulates tools.
Right.
And it has to have a certain kind of weakness that it had to overcome. So that's why, his theory is that's why we developed brains. So he has these, I don't remember exactly what the rest of it is, but he has like 3 ingredients. And so his theory is that if we encounter life somewhere, it's going to have these 3 things.
Some elements of those, yes.
Interesting.
Yeah. And his theory is that it developed from a weakness. So we had to do these things because we were so insufficient at surviving in life.
Right.
Like if you think about humans, they're vulnerable, exposed to temperature changes. We have to scavenge to survive. There's a lot of drawbacks to being human, but that has led us to evolve these other abilities. And so his theory was that it's the same thing. If intelligent life does exist elsewhere, then they have to have, the opposable thumb or tentacle or whatever appendage to manipulate tools because you would have evolved from weakness. The only way to become super intelligent and get to the top of your food chain as a very physically incompetent being is to have these other abilities.
Yeah, that's to really manipulate your environment.
Yeah, that's a really interesting theory, and I'm not saying I disagree with it, but it's also very ethnocentric. It's completely founded on the human experience. So as writers, I think we need to look at every side of the problem and then say, what if? Like, could I create a world that defies that theory? Where those aren't, or that's not the situation.
Isn't that why we tell stories, right? To figure out whether these things could be true? Yeah.
Definitely.
I think that's a great thought exercise.
Cool. Final thoughts on first contact stories?
Well, I think maybe every time you write a new story, it's first contact.
Yeah, no kidding. And I think it does apply to every genre. So writers, go write your first contact story in whatever genre you love to write and tell us about it. I'd love to hear how it goes.
Yeah, I'd love to hear.
Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.